The crystalline gardens of Station Meridian stretched across 3 biodomes, each one representing different worlds from across the Federation. Thomas Webb sat on a weathered bench near the thermal zones, picking at his lunch with little enthusiasm. The protein bar tasted like cardboard, but it was all his meal credits could afford this week. Around him, wealthy students from a dozen different species laughed and talked, their expensive meals spread out like feasts. Thomas kept his head down, focusing on the xenobiology notes displayed on his worn datapad. He had come to Meridian Station with dreams of becoming a bridge between species, understanding the vast tapestry of life that filled the galaxy. His mother had worked 3 jobs back on Earth to send him here, and he carried that weight with him every day. While other human students complained about the food or the accommodations, Thomas reminded himself that simply being here was a miracle. He studied harder than anyone, stayed longer in the libraries, and asked more questions than his professors appreciated. The afternoon light filtered through the dome's transparent aluminum panels, casting strange shadows across the volcanic section of the gardens. Thomas had always been drawn to this area. Most students avoided it because the heat was uncomfortable, the rocks were sharp, and nothing particularly beautiful grew there. But Thomas found peace in the emptiness. He could think here, dream here, without the constant reminder of how much he didn't belong among the galaxy's elite. A sound interrupted his thoughts. Not the usual hum of environmental systems or the distant chatter of other students. This was different. A scraping, like claws on stone, followed by a soft whimper that made his chest tighten. Thomas set down his protein bar and stood slowly, his eyes scanning the black volcanic rocks. Academy regulations were clear about investigating strange noises. He should contact security immediately. But curiosity had always been his weakness, or perhaps his strength, depending on who you asked. He moved toward the sound, his footsteps careful on the heated stones. The temperature rose with each step, and sweat began to bead on his forehead. Between 2 massive chunks of obsidian, something moved. Something small and desperate. Thomas crouched down, his breath catching as he saw what hid in the shadows. The creature was no bigger than a terrier, covered in scales that should have gleamed like precious gems but instead looked dull and lifeless. Its wings, magnificent structures designed for flight, hung broken and twisted. One eye watched him with an intelligence that sent chills down his spine. Thomas had seen pictures in his textbooks. Everyone in the known galaxy recognized a dragon, even a dying one. The species was ancient, powerful, and notoriously private. They lived in the far reaches of space, on worlds so harsh that few other species could survive there. They served in the Federation's highest councils, commanded fleets, and were respected above almost all other races. And here, dying in a neglected corner of a garden, was one of their children. The dragon hatchling made a sound that was part chirp, part whimper. Its ribs showed clearly through translucent scales. Its breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps. Thomas knew the protocols. Dragons were protected under so many treaties and laws that even looking at one wrong could start diplomatic incidents. If anyone discovered he had found this creature and not immediately reported it, his entire future could collapse. His scholarship could be revoked. He could be sent back to Earth in disgrace. The hatchling's eye closed, its strength fading. Thomas made his decision in the span of a heartbeat. He turned and walked quickly back to his bench, grabbed his protein bar and water bottle, and returned to the volcanic rocks. The dragon watched him approach, too weak to flee or fight, its body tensed with the last reserves of survival instinct. Thomas sat down on the hot stones about an arm's length away and broke off a small piece of his lunch. "Hey there," he said softly, keeping his voice calm and even. His grandmother had taught him that tone mattered more than words with frightened creatures. "You look like you could use a friend." He placed the piece of food on the ground and slid it forward gently. The dragon didn't move, but its eye followed the offering. Thomas waited, controlling his breathing, making himself as non-threatening as possible. The heat from the rock seeped through his pants. His water bottle would be empty soon in this temperature, but none of that mattered. After several long minutes, the hatchling crept forward. It moved with painful slowness, each motion clearly costing it precious energy. It sniffed the food, then looked at Thomas with an expression he could only describe as questioning. "It's yours," Thomas whispered. "Go ahead." The dragon ate delicately despite its obvious starvation, taking small bites and chewing carefully. When it finished, Thomas offered another piece. They continued this way, the boy and the dragon, until 3/4 of his lunch was gone. The hatchling's movements became slightly less labored. Its breathing evened out just a fraction. Thomas dared to move closer, studying the injured wing. The membrane had torn badly, and infection had started along the edges. Without treatment, the wing would never heal properly. The dragon would never fly. Thomas pulled his basic medical kit from his backpack, the one his mother had insisted he carry. He had used it mostly for minor cuts and headaches, never imagining it might save a dragon's life. "I'm going to help your wing," Thomas explained, moving with deliberate slowness. "It's going to hurt, but I promise I'm trying to make it better." He didn't know if the creature understood his words, but he hoped his intentions were clear. The dragon watched him but didn't pull away as he carefully cleaned the wound with sanitizing solution. It flinched when he applied the medical gel, a soft keen escaping its throat. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes at the sound of such pain from something so small. He worked as gently as possible, using surgical tape to support the damaged membrane. It was crude work, nothing like what a proper veterinarian could do, but it was better than nothing. When he finished, the dragon looked at its wing, then back at Thomas. Something shifted in its gaze. The fear receded, replaced by what Thomas could only describe as gratitude. The hatchling moved closer and pressed its head against his hand. The scales felt rough and cool despite the heat around them. Thomas sat with the dragon as the afternoon faded into evening. He gave it the last of his water, watching as it drank greedily. He knew he should report this. Every rule said so. But looking at this small, broken creature that had somehow survived against impossible odds, Thomas made a different choice. He carefully gathered the hatchling into his arms, feeling how light it was, how fragile. The dragon didn't struggle, simply curled against his chest with a soft sigh. "Let's get you somewhere safe," Thomas whispered, standing slowly. His quarters were small and cramped, shared with a roommate who was rarely there. He could hide the dragon for a while, at least until it was stronger. At least until he figured out what to do. As he walked through the darkening gardens toward the residential sectors, Thomas had no idea that his life had just changed forever. He had no idea that by morning, he would face a decision that would alter the course of his destiny and the fate of 2 species. All he knew was that the small creature in his arms needed him, and he would not abandon it. The stars visible through the dome's transparent panels seemed to shine brighter as Thomas carried his secret burden home. Behind him, in the shadows of the volcanic rocks, something glittered in the fading light. A single scale, fallen from the hatchling's body, that began to pulse with a soft golden glow. A beacon, calling out across the void of space to others of its kind. The message was simple and undeniable: the lost one had been found. Thomas woke to the sound of thunder, except the station didn't have weather systems that could produce thunder. His eyes snapped open in the dim light of his quarters, his heart already racing. The small dragon hatchling slept in a nest of blankets he had made on the floor, its breathing steady and stronger than the night before. The thundering sound came again, and Thomas realized with growing dread that it was coming from outside the station. From space itself. He stumbled to the window and felt his legs nearly give out. Ships filled the void beyond the station. Not ordinary ships. These were draconian vessels, organic-looking constructs that seemed to have been grown rather than built. They spiraled and curved in impossible shapes, their hulls covered in scales that caught and reflected the light of distant stars. There were dozens of them, ranging from small fighters to massive dreadnoughts that dwarfed the station itself. Thomas had seen pictures of dragon ships in his studies, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of their presence. His communicator exploded with alerts. Emergency broadcasts. Station-wide announcements. His hands shook as he activated the device. The face of Station Director Hammond appeared, the man's usually composed features tight with barely controlled panic. All students and staff are to proceed immediately to the main assembly hall. This is not a drill. A delegation from the Dragon Sovereignty has arrived and is requesting an immediate audience. All personnel are to comply with security protocols. Thomas looked at the sleeping hatchling, then back at the armada outside. His mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. They had come for the dragon. Somehow, they knew. He would be arrested, tried, possibly executed for interfering with a protected species. His mother would receive the news that her son had thrown away everything she had sacrificed for. The hatchling stirred in its makeshift nest, opening one eye to look at him. In that gaze, Thomas saw trust. Simple, absolute trust that he would protect it. The communicator buzzed again. His roommate, a jovial centaurian named Dax, appeared on the screen. Webb. Where are you? The entire dragon fleet just showed up. Actual dragons, Thomas. In formation. You need to see this. Dax's enthusiasm was typical, but even he sounded shaken. Thomas closed the connection and sat down on his bed, trying to think. He could leave the hatchling here and go to the assembly. He could claim ignorance. But if they searched the quarters, and they certainly would, the dragon would be found. He could try to hide it somewhere else, but where? The station had sensors everywhere. He could try to explain, to tell them he had only been helping, but would they believe him? Would they care? His fingers drummed against his knee, a nervous habit his mother had always tried to break him of. The hatchling watched him, and Thomas saw something remarkable in its expression. Calm. As if it knew everything would be all right. As if it trusted him to make the right choice. Thomas stood and moved to his small closet, pulling out his cleanest shirt and jacket. If he was going to face whatever waited in that assembly hall, he would do it properly. He dressed quickly, his movements automatic, his mind still churning through scenarios. The hatchling stood as well, stretching its wings carefully. The damaged one moved better after the night's rest and Thomas's crude treatment. The dragon chirped softly, a sound that was almost questioning. I have to go, Thomas said, kneeling beside it. I don't know what's happening, but I need you to stay here and stay quiet. Can you do that? The hatchling tilted its head, then did something that shocked Thomas to his core. It spoke. Not in words, but directly into his mind. The sensation was like cool water flowing through his thoughts, carrying meaning and emotion beyond language. You saved me. I will not hide while you face consequences alone. Thomas fell backward, his heart hammering. Dragons were telepathic. He had read about it, but experiencing it was entirely different. The hatchling's thoughts felt ancient and young simultaneously, wise and innocent. You can't come, Thomas said aloud, then thought the words as clearly as he could. They'll take you away. They'll punish me. It's better if you hide. The dragon's response carried the emotional weight of absolute certainty. They will not harm you. You are mine now, as I am yours. We face this together. Before Thomas could argue further, the hatchling moved to the door. It looked back at him, waiting. Thomas realized he had no choice. He couldn't force the dragon to stay, and somehow, he didn't want to. If this was the end of his time at the academy, at least he wouldn't face it alone. The corridors were chaos. Students and staff rushed toward the assembly hall, their faces showing everything from excitement to terror. Thomas walked among them with the small dragon at his heels. He expected someone to notice, to shout, to point. But in the confusion, with everyone's attention focused on reaching the assembly hall, no one looked down. The hatchling moved with surprising grace, staying close to Thomas's leg, almost invisible in the press of bodies. The assembly hall could hold 5,000 people comfortably. Today, it held nearly 7,000, all crammed together in tight rows. The stage at the front was usually used for ceremonies and announcements. Now, it held something that made Thomas's breath catch. Dragons. 5 of them stood on the stage, their true forms revealed. They were magnificent. The smallest was twice Thomas's height, covered in scales that shimmered like molten metal. The largest dominated the space, its presence so commanding that even from the back of the hall, Thomas felt the weight of its authority. Director Hammond stood beside them, looking like a child next to giants. His voice, amplified through the hall's systems, shook slightly as he spoke. Students and staff of Meridian Station, we have been honored with a visit from representatives of the Dragon Sovereignty. They have traveled far and seek someone among us. I ask that you cooperate fully with their request. The largest dragon stepped forward, and when it spoke, every person in the hall felt the words resonating in their bones. We seek a human, the dragon said, its voice like mountains moving. One who showed kindness without expectation of reward. One who risked everything for a creature not of his kind. One who bound himself to our youngest without knowing what such a bond would mean. The dragon's eyes, vast and golden, swept across the assembled crowd. We seek the one who saved Ember of the Ashenvale clutch. Step forward, and know that you have nothing to fear. Thomas felt the hatchling press against his leg. Ember. The dragon had a name. He looked around and saw thousands of faces, all confused, all wondering who among them had done this thing. He could stay silent. He could let the moment pass. But Thomas Webb had never been good at taking the easy path. He had never been able to ignore someone in need. He took a deep breath and raised his hand. Here, he called out, his voice lost in the vastness of the hall. I'm here. Heads turned toward him. The crowd parted. Thomas began walking forward, Ember at his side, and every step felt like walking toward either his salvation or his doom. The walk to the stage felt endless. Thomas's legs moved automatically while his mind screamed at him to run, to hide, to do anything except continue forward. But Ember walked beside him with perfect confidence, the small dragon's presence somehow steadying. Students and staff pulled back as they passed, creating a corridor through the mass of bodies. Whispers rippled outward like waves. Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the stage ahead, on the massive dragons waiting there with expressions he couldn't read. When he reached the front, the stairs to the stage seemed impossibly high. Thomas climbed them anyway, his hand gripping the railing to keep from shaking. Director Hammond's face had gone pale, his eyes fixed on Ember with dawning horror and understanding. The small hatchling paid no attention to anyone except the largest dragon, the one who had spoken. Ember chirped softly, a sound of recognition and joy, then spread its wings. The damaged one still hung awkwardly, but the gesture was clear. A greeting. A homecoming. The massive dragon's expression transformed. The commanding authority melted into something Thomas recognized because he had seen it on his own mother's face. Relief. Love. Fear transformed into joy. The dragon lowered its enormous head until it was level with the hatchling, and Thomas heard a rumbling purr that vibrated through the floor. Little Flame, the dragon whispered, its mental voice carrying to everyone in the hall. We thought you lost forever. Ember chirped again and pressed against the larger dragon's snout. Thomas stood awkwardly to the side, suddenly feeling like an intruder in a reunion he didn't understand. But then Ember turned and looked at him, and the hatchling's thoughts flowed into his mind with crystal clarity. This is my father. Grandfather to 1,000 generations. Guardian of the Ashenvale territories. And this is Thomas Webb, who found me dying and gave me life. Who risked everything when he owed me nothing. Who is mine. The way Ember said that last word carried weight that Thomas felt in his soul. The 5 dragons on stage all turned their attention to him fully for the first time, and Thomas understood why people feared these creatures. Their gaze held the weight of centuries, of power beyond human comprehension, of intelligence that had mapped stars when humanity was still learning to make fire. The lead dragon, Ember's father, studied Thomas with eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone into the core of who he was. "Thomas Webb of Earth," the dragon said, speaking aloud so all could hear. "Do you understand what you have done?" Thomas swallowed hard, finding his voice through sheer force of will. "I found Ember hurt and starving. I fed them. I treated their wounds. I kept them safe." He lifted his chin, meeting those golden eyes despite the fear coursing through him. "If that was wrong, then I'll accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate. But I'd do it again." A sound rippled through the assembled dragons. It took Thomas a moment to recognize it as laughter. Not mocking, but genuinely amused. The lead dragon's expression softened further. "Punishment? Child of Earth, you misunderstand entirely. We came here to honor you, not to punish you." The dragon shifted, and Thomas realized the massive creature was actually sitting, lowering itself to seem less threatening. "My daughter was lost during a diplomatic mission. A malfunction in our ship scattered the emergency pods. We have been searching for 3 cycles, scouring every station and planet in this sector." Another dragon, smaller but with scales that gleamed like copper, stepped forward. Her voice was gentler, distinctly feminine. "We feared the worst. Hatchlings cannot survive long without care. Without food. Without the warmth of family." She looked at Thomas with gratitude that made his chest tight. "You gave our child what we could not. You bridged the gap when we were too far away." Thomas's mind reeled. "But the laws. The treaties. I thought I was breaking every rule by helping." The lead dragon made that rumbling purr again, and this time Thomas felt it was approving. "The laws exist to prevent exploitation and harm. You did neither. You showed the very quality those laws were meant to protect. Compassion across species boundaries. The willingness to help another living being simply because they needed help." Director Hammond finally found his voice, though it came out higher than usual. "Ambassador Ashenvale, if I may. How did you know to come here? How did you know it was Mr. Webb who found your daughter?" The dragon Ember had called father turned his attention to the director. "All dragons carry within them a spark of our home fire. When that spark encounters true kindness, true sacrifice, it responds. It sends out a signal that only our kind can detect. Last night, Ember's spark ignited for the first time, calling us here." Ember chirped proudly and pressed against Thomas's leg. Thomas looked down at the small dragon, seeing the creature in a new light. "The spark is more than a signal," the copper-scaled dragon explained. "It is the beginning of a bond. Rare. Precious. Sacred to our kind. The human and dragon linked by the spark become tied in ways that transcend species. You feel each other's strong emotions. You can find each other across vast distances. In time, you may share thoughts as easily as speaking." Thomas felt his knees weaken. He reached out to steady himself on a nearby podium. "A bond? But I'm just a student. I'm nobody. I barely have enough credits to eat. I can't possibly be tied to a dragon for life." Ember's thoughts flooded his mind with such force that Thomas gasped. Images flashed before his inner eye. Thomas sitting with Ember through the night, checking the hatchlings breathing, adjusting the blanket nest. Thomas offering not half his food, but almost all of it, keeping only enough to not pass out himself. Thomas speaking softly to a creature who shouldn't understand words, offering comfort through tone and presence alone. "You gave everything you had," Ember's voice resonated in his thoughts. "You had so little, and you gave it freely. You did not see a dragon or a political consequence. You saw someone suffering and helped. That is why the spark chose you. That is why I choose you. Ambassador Ashenvale moved closer to Thomas, the massive dragon somehow managing to seem gentle despite his size. The bond cannot be forced or broken. It simply is. My daughter has chosen you as her bond companion, and you have accepted by your actions. This is a gift beyond measure, Thomas Webb. And it comes with responsibilities. Thomas's mind spun with implications. Responsibilities? I don't understand. I just helped because it seemed like the right thing to do. The ambassador's expression was ancient and wise. And that is precisely why you were chosen. The bond requires a pure heart. Dragons live for millennia, Thomas. We remember every slight, every kindness, every moment of our existence. Ember will grow. In 100 years, she will be large enough to carry continents on her back. In 1,000, she will command fleets. And through all of that, you will be her anchor. Her connection to humility and compassion. The copper dragon added, but the bond gives as much as it takes. You will share in Ember's strength. Your lifespan will extend to match hers. You will learn our ways, our knowledge, our history. You will become more than human, though you will never stop being human. You will bridge two worlds. Thomas looked around the assembly hall. Thousands of faces stared back at him, showing everything from awe to envy to disbelief. He thought of his mother, working those 3 jobs to give him this chance. He thought of his dreams of becoming a bridge between species. He thought of the small dragon pressed against his leg, trusting him with absolute faith. I don't know how to be whatever you need me to be, Thomas said honestly. I'm still learning. I make mistakes. I'm not special. Ambassador Ashenvale's laugh was like distant thunder. You are extraordinary, Thomas Webb, precisely because you do not see it. You have bound yourself to the daughter of the Ashenvale line, one of the oldest and most powerful clutches in dragon history. You have become, whether you know it or not, a prince among our kind. And you did it all by simply being kind. The ambassador stood to his full height, and his voice carried to every corner of the hall. Let it be known across all territories, all stations, all worlds. Thomas Webb of Earth stands under the protection of the Ashenvale clutch. Any who harm him, harm us. Any who honor him, honor us. He is bond companion to Ember, and through her, he is family to all dragons. The proclamation rang through the hall, followed by stunned silence. Then, slowly, applause began. It started with a few scattered claps and built into a roar that shook the walls. Thomas stood frozen on the stage, Ember at his side, surrounded by dragons who had declared him family, while thousands watched his life transform in a single moment. He thought about the protein bar he had shared. The medical tape holding together a broken wing. The simple act of sitting with a frightened creature in a garden. Such small things. Such enormous consequences. The ambassador leaned down until his massive head was level with Thomas's. You gave my daughter life when she was dying. You gave her hope when she had none. You gave her kindness when the universe had been cruel. How could we see that as anything less than miraculous? Ember's thoughts brushed Thomas's mind gently. My friend. My bond companion. My chosen family. Will you accept this? Will you walk this path with me, though it leads to places you never imagined? Thomas looked into the small dragon's eyes and saw his future stretching out before him. Not the future he had planned, with its careful studies and modest goals. But something larger. Something terrifying and wonderful and impossible to refuse. Yes, he said simply, both aloud and in his thoughts. I'll walk with you, Ember. Wherever this path leads. The bond between them flared like a star being born, and Thomas felt it settling into his chest. A warmth that would never fade. A connection that would never break. He had come to Meridian Station hoping to bridge the gap between species. He had no idea he would do it so literally, so completely, so permanently. But as Ember chirped with joy and the assembled dragons hummed their approval, Thomas felt something he had rarely experienced in his life. He felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The assembly hall erupted in celebration, but Thomas barely heard it. He was too focused on the small dragon at his side, the creature who had chosen him out of all the beings in the galaxy. The creature who had seen worth in a poor human student with nothing but kindness to offer. Together, they stood on that stage while the future unfurled before them like wings spreading for the first time. And Thomas Webb, who had only wanted to help, found himself at the beginning of a story that would be told across the stars for generations to come.